Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. This seems to be a particularly timely moment to address today's subject, which is the Putin-Trump era, what next for Russia, Ukraine, and the world. I'm sure we can wrap that all up very nicely within an hour. Of course, we are also only too keenly aware of a great absence from our midst today, that of our dear friend and founder, Lord Lothian. Michael had originally scheduled this event for last October. He saw it as of great importance then. It's only grown in importance since then, I'm sure you'll agree, and I know that Michael would have wanted us to continue with the event as we are, and in a way this is part of our larger tribute to him and to all of his work on our behalf. We miss him very much indeed, and we hope somewhere he's listening and smiling rather wryly. Michael was not just founder and key driver of the Global Strategy Forum, but he was also a very generous benefactor. And his generosity in large part enabled GSF to put on so many wonderful lunchtime events on so many important subjects. And many, if not most, if not all of you in this room will have attended them, I'm sure. We plan to continue with Michael's scheduled program, but we also want to go beyond that and continue this series of lunchtime events. To do so, though, we will require the necessary funding. So in that regard, may I most warmly thank those of you who have renewed your subscription to GSF, those of you who have taken out new subscriptions, and for those of you who fall into neither category, can I encourage you, either on your own behalf or on behalf of your organizations, to take out such a subscription. And if anyone else here has any ideas or ways that they think they could contribute to keeping the organization going, please do see Jacqueline Jinks afterwards. It's extremely important to us, and I hope you'll agree that this forum really provides an extremely interesting and useful contribution to the discussion of events in this crazy world. Well, on to today's event, and it is a hybrid event, as you will see. For those of you who are participating on Zoom, it's a view-only event, so if you do have questions during the later Q&A period, please pose them via the Q&A function on Zoom, and we'll then deal with them in the room. For those of you who are in the room, please wait until the microphone reaches you before speaking, so everyone can hear the question, including those online. And please, as always, do say who you are beforehand, and try to keep your question short and punchy so we can get in as many as possible. The event is being recorded and it will be available later on online. Please do continue to monitor the website for details of when and where it will be available. Now, we're enormously privileged today, enormously grateful to be able to welcome as our guest, as our speaker, Professor Mark Galeotti. He will be known to you all. He is one of the world's leading experts on Russian politics, security, and crime, words that strangely seem to go together well in the same sentence. He has an enormous and hugely impressive CV, which I'm sure you've all read, and I won't repeat it for you now. Safe to say that, of course, he is the author of a great many books, two of which, Downfall and Forged in War, are available for sale here today. I can warmly recommend them both. So if you haven't already got your copies, please do so afterwards, and you'll get a free Galeotti signature thrown in for good measure. Mark is going to speak for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have a conversation for about 10 minutes or so and open the floor to wider questions. And as always, we'll plan on finishing on time on the hour so you can all get away to your afternoon events. So, Mark, a very warm welcome to you. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. Well, I say thank you to ask me in 20 minutes to encapsulate this extraordinarily unfolding modern world, and to do so in a room with no visible clock. So please excuse me, if I look at my watch, it's not that I'm beginning to bore even myself. It's just that I'm checking to see how I'm doing on time. So this event is notionally the Putin/Trump era. But the interesting thing is, I think actually it's more true, I think, to say that Putin himself is now also living in Trump world like the rest of us. He may be in a relatively more privileged position than some, but I think one thing I'd want to bring out, and this inevitably means I'm going to be talking about Donald Trump, both because it's unavoidable, but also because it has sort of clear bearing on this. And let me just throw in the health warning that I'm a Russianist. not an American politicist or a Trumpologist. I'm sure we'll have that now. So this is, when I'm talking about Trump, it's my own perspectives. But I think one has to start from the relationship between Trump and Putin. And let me just say out front, something that will no doubt infuriate some, is that I do not believe that Donald Trump is some kind of Russian agent. It would be great to believe that, and it would also have so many spin-off movie opportunities. But it's a little glib, and it's also a little hard to sustain in an era when, frankly, Bellingcat can tell you the shoe size of any Russian assassin. To think that over the years, over the decades, nothing at all concrete has been drawn up. But perhaps more importantly, when I was in the first batch of Brits who were indefinitely banned from Russia in June 2022, so I haven't been back since November 2021. But I still talk to people, and I had a very interesting conversation some time back with someone I've known for, well, God, it makes me feel very old, decades, who works in the presidential administration, and who was actually saying the degree to which so many within his team were actually concerned about Donald Trump. That this notion that Donald Trump is Russia's friend should better be framed as Donald Trump is Russia's friend today. Whatever Donald Trump is today, he may be something very, very different tomorrow. And if Donald Trump is your enemy, just ask Volodymyr Zelensky. It's a very dangerous place to be. The Russians have always relied on the Americans being the grown-ups in the room. So the Russians get to be the daring ones who go right up to the red lines because they can rely on the West generally, but the United States in particular, to be the ones to actually calm things down. You can't really rely on Donald Trump in those terms. And instead, I think what we have is an interesting situation in which, from Trump's point of view, I mean, the glib point to say is that he's never met an autocrat he doesn't like. But I think it's true that, you know, he is a wannabe strongman. He wants to be in the club. He likes that sense of the sort of red-blooded, president as monarch. But perhaps more importantly even than that is, I think he and Vladimir Putin, ironically enough, share a certain sense of the worldview. But the world is essentially a zero-sum place in which there are a handful of nations which are great powers, and then the rest, the only question is really whose vassal they are. It's a world in which might always makes right, obviously. And it's a world in which everything is transactional. Issues, like values and the like, they're just the sizzle, not the sausage. They are how you sell your policy, maybe, but they're not what you base your policy on. And if someone else says that they are basing their policy on values, well, they're trying to pull one over on you. So, I mean, I think in that context, although they're very different men in so many different ways, they have different specific interests, but actually Putin and Trump can see eye to eye, even before one starts thinking about whole issues of the sort of gender politics and everything else. And so, in that context, the idea that ultimately Putin is dealing with not just this kind of secular monarch of the most powerful nation in the world, man who in many ways kind of sees himself more as the chief executive officer of USA Incorporated than a statesman and the representative of all his people. What does this actually mean for Ukraine, and what does this mean for Russia? Now, we've had the interesting news, although we don't know yet the full details, but that a agreement on minerals, all these magical rare earths, as well as oil and gas, has been agreed with, between Ukrainians and the Americans, and that Zelensky may be going to the United States on Friday to sign it. And it's hard to say whether this is a success or a defeat for the Ukrainians. It's not this ludicrous $500 billion sort of debt, in effect, that Trump had originally said. It's about creating a fund for the future reconstruction, of which a certain proportion America will own, and essentially be able to skim the profits off therefrom. This is a good thing for Ukraine if it means that America then feels it has some kind of stake in the country. And at least it does reflect some kind of assumption that there will be a Ukraine, a sovereign Ukraine that actually, deals struck with it are worth the paper on which they're printed. But on the other hand, it clearly suggests something about a world in which Ukraine has to continually not so much sing for its supper as pay for it, and pay for America's supper too while it's at it. But I was at Munich for the security conference, where there was obviously a certain amount of shock and horror following Vice President J.D. Vance's speech, in which he sort of castigated the Europeans for being bad Democrats. And, it's a strange place, the Munich Security Conference. Something of a hothouse. You have, 2,000-odd delegates, 500 journalists, all in this bubble behind a medium-sized army of German police, and a lot of free alcohol. And so no wonder, to a degree, it has a tendency to sort of generate slightly overblown perspectives. There was certainly a lot of overblown perspectives. But I was talking to an American official I'd known for a long time, who could certainly not be considered to be a Trumpist. But nonetheless, amidst all this sort of sound and fury, he was saying, look, Trump is one thing, and Trump's utterances on the day are always going to seem rather bizarre and so forth. But first of all, there are also a lot of quite smart and quite disciplined people around him within the administration. And there is a sense of a plan. And that plan is not just simply to give Putin everything he wants, because Trump likes to think of himself as the master deal maker. And instead, what Trump is trying to do is to get Putin to the table. And if he has to throw out some meaningless concessions, because let's be perfectly honest, all this talk about Ukraine will inevitably become part of NATO. Inevitably is one of the words you use when you don't want to say imminently or foreseeably. Actually, the chances of Ukraine being soon within NATO were pretty much nil. And likewise, to say that Ukraine for the moment is unlikely to regain all or most of the occupied territories back, yes, it's a hard thing to hear, but again, when people are off the record and off the mic, essentially that was what people knew was the situation. It doesn't preclude, in due course, a liberation, a reuniting or whatever. Just ask the East Germans. But the idea that somehow Ukraine was going to drive every single Russian soldier off every single square inch of occupied territory, and that the war would end there rather than just simply moving the front line to the national border, was always something of a pipe dream, and frankly becoming even more of a pipe dream as time went on. So the idea is, in fact, rather than sort of having thrown away two high-value cards at the beginning of the negotiations, the notion is, and I'm just simply saying this is what I was getting from someone who's pretty well connected within the national security community. The idea was actually this was just something to basically get Putin to the table, because that sense that once he's at the table, he can't really walk away. He can't walk away without risking alienating Trump, and that's something that the Russians would consider dangerous. So I don't think we should regard anything as a given at this stage. Ukraine has not been thrown under the bus. Ukraine is now experiencing a very, very tough love, compared with what in the past was in some ways a rather kind of indulgent love. Promising Ukraine things that actually we didn't intend to provide was not a positive thing. And I really hate the fact that it sounds like I'm now defending the Trump foreign policy. But nonetheless, we have to recognize that the reality of the situation. It is very much all to play for in terms of what kind of a country Ukraine gets to be, how sovereign. And I think that's, and Ukraine is going to have a stake in that. The Riyadh talks were really about US-Russian relations. Yes, of course, the Ukraine talks were part of that. But if you look at, for example, what the Russian serious commentariat, and I'm not talking about the kind of lunatics who go on evening television to say about how Britain should be nuked and so forth, because we are, of course, the source of all their problems. I always find it sort of very charming that someone thinks Britain still matters, and unfortunately, that's Russian hyper-nationalists. But the serious Russian commentators, I mean, actually what they were focusing on was the end of isolation. The fact that now you have the Americans and the Russians talking to each other, and a sense that that was going to continue. And if there's deals done over Ukraine, that's great, but that's a plus. That, for them, was the important thing. And what seems to be emerging is the possibility of essentially a two-track process for now. There's no point trying to get Zelensky and Putin to sit down at a table at the moment, because they wouldn't. Not least because Putin claims that Zelensky is not legitimate, a claim that's rather unfortunate that Donald Trump is echoing. But the idea is that essentially you have one track, which is the Americans talking to the Russians, and another, which is the Americans talking to the Ukrainians, largely through General Kellogg. And the sense of if they can move things further along, then there will come a point in the future when you can actually unite these tracks. But it's not worth doing now. But the point is, exactly, there is thought, there is conversation about Ukraine's future. So let's not write Ukraine off, not least because the Ukrainians are determined not to write Ukraine off. And when it comes down to it, whatever Trump thinks he can decide, of course the Ukrainians have a veto. Sure, the Americans could, if need be, yank all foreign aid, but I think we are a long way from that being a possibility. So what does this mean for Putin? He is faced with an opportunity, I would say, that he may well squander, because he does tend to squander many opportunities, to actually wrench some kind of mutilated victory from what was beginning to look like a defeat. And remember, Putin is not a daring man. He went into Ukraine in February 2022 because he thought it was going to be easy. You know, he who doesn't believe that Ukraine really exists as a country, he doesn't believe the Ukrainians as a people exist, he thought that he could just roll in, impose some kind of puppet regime, and he would have regathered the core Russian lands. Belarus is already a sort of vassal state in effect. Ukraine would become, and then the great three Slavic heartlands would have been brought together by, I knew, Vladimir the Great, gatherer of the Russian lands. And of course, no one around him dared tell him otherwise. I mean, this is what's happened. I mean, Putin has, like so many autocrats before him, over time, shrunk the circle of people whom he listens to, until it's essentially people who are like him, or people who are just willing to pretend to be like him in order to be in the room. You know, his own Federal Security Service was telling him they had this huge network of agents in place who were all ready to declare for Russia and for a new government and disrupt the activities of the Ukrainian state. Turned out not to be the case. Turned out there were a lot of Ukrainians who were perfectly happy to take Moscow's money, right up to the point when they actually had to do something about it. So this was meant to be easy, and it's not. And, well, I mean, the formulation I tend to use is that Russia is losing, but Ukraine is losing faster. I mean, yes, in the current sort of situation, Russia still does have the advantage, but at terrible cost, not just in terms of human lives, but in terms of the economy. 40% of the federal budget is going on defense and security. More to the point, you're seeing deep scarring beginning to emerge within the economy, caused by everything from inflation to the fact that there is an over-squeezed labor market. That will come to bite. We're seeing those huge stockpiles of Soviet-era tanks and personnel carriers and artillery pieces also being denuded. And there seems to be a growing consensus within the sort of the Russian technocratic elite, which are not necessarily the people whom Putin listens to, but their consensus is precisely 2026 is going to be when a lot of these vulture-sized chickens come home to roost. So there are going to be a lot of people who are going to be telling Putin, if you can make a deal now, make a deal. And Putin will be able to spin a deal now if it means that he gets to keep the occupied territories as a triumph. Remember, as far as Putin is concerned, what's going on in Ukraine is not actually just a war against Ukraine. It's a war against the West, against NATO, with this just being one particularly pyrotechnic front in that war. But so the propagandists will duly rush out and say, look, we fought NATO to a standstill. We held these territories which are historically Russian and inhabited by Russian speakers, etc., etc. And a lot of people, quite frankly, are going to be willing to go along with it. They have good reason to say that the emperor's clothes are absolutely marvelous because, precisely, they're delighted to see an end to the war. A growing share of Russians want negotiations. Now remember, negotiations does not necessarily mean concessions. So let's keep that cautiously. But certainly a majority of Russians want those. And over 70% of Russians say that they would support any peace deal that Putin signs. In other words, if Putin gives them the alibi, they'll be delighted. So we have an interesting confluence to kind of conclude. And in part, it's precisely because of the uncertainties that Donald Trump brings to the world order. From Ukraine's point of view, there is the threat that actually the United States might dramatically scale down or even stop its aid. And that might be unlikely, but the consequences of that would be very, very serious indeed. But from the Russians' point of view, there's also that sense of, can they really take Trump for granted? I mean, remember, if he were sort of, being run by some smart sort of operator in the Lubyanka, Agent Orange is being sort of dispatched out there. His first term as president, at the end of that first term, American policy towards Russia was tougher than it had been at any point since 1991. To a large extent, that's because Congress essentially took over Russia policy. But the point is, Trump was not willing to burn political capital in order to do anything about it. We saw what for the Russians were shocking moments, like the point when, in response to a chemical weapons attack, Trump launched a cruise missile strike on Syria. Now, I happened to be in Russia around that time and had a conversation with a staffer from the foreign ministry who said, look, this is our worst nightmare. An American president with a low threshold for the use of force, who literally changes policy overnight, and who, never mind not warning his sort of enemies, but doesn't even consult with his allies before doing that. There is this sense that Trump provides opportunities, but also risks. So what's going to happen? I have no idea. That's the honest answer. I know I should sort of pontificate as if I had all the answers. I don't, but that's the whole point. In some ways, I think that the most striking thing about Trump world is the lack of predictability that it provides at the moment. And the countries which are going to be successful, the leaders which are going to be successful, are those who are able not only to try and guide Trump in different directions, and we'll see how Keir Starmer has any luck following the Macron intervention, but also who adapts to that very uncertainty. All I can say is it's not going to be an easy time for all of us. I'll stop there.
Well, Mark, thank you very much indeed. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions on the Trump dimension. So let me just focus for a moment on Russia. You have sought in your work and in your books to give it, and indeed today, to give us a much better insight into Russia. So my first question to you really is, do you think there is a deep and wide enough understanding of Russia and its motivations and the ideas and pressures that lie behind its actions within government circles in the UK?
Of course not. The sad truth of the matter is that, for reasons, some of them good, most of them bad, There has been a historic process of essentially a running down of expertise, and not just on Russia, but obviously Russia is the one that I care about. And as a result, what we have is a situation in which you have a relative handful of people who do often have real expertise within government, but not a critical mass. You have the fact that actually one needs to have that critical mass of different voices because everybody gets things wrong, even me. And therefore one needs not to be relying on a relative handful of individuals. And the issue of outreach, because there is still, despite the fact that, within the university sector, there's also been a depressing decline in Russian studies. But to be able to draw on that, and frankly, we're not as good as, say, the Americans are in reaching out beyond government circles, but to be able to draw on that, you need to know who you need to be talking to. And the risk is otherwise that you get people who are ardent self-propagandists, again, like me, who may have a disproportionate voice, whereas the people who actually have really interesting, important things to say, because they're not pushing themselves out and writing something for The Spectator every other Wednesday or whatever, don't get listened to and don't get brought up. So, I think in this respect, we have to realize that there's a lot of very good technical focus, particularly within, if one thinks of the MOD, focused knowledge about Russia. But big picture stuff, no. And this is why we have not been very good at identifying, I think, the broad trends in place, despite the often valiant work of people in the now very, very sort of foreshortened embassy in Moscow and the like.
So what is your advice to the FCDO?
Well, clearly it's to spend vastly more money on people like me. No, generally, there's nothing we can do effectively quickly to ramp up. There are initiatives like, bringing in people on secondment to the Eastern Research Group, though there are also mechanical issues as to how far the analysts actually get listened to by the desk officers. I don't think there is a sort of a magic quick answer. I think it's more to learn the lesson, because otherwise we tend to almost go by fashion and fad. That something's really important, we need to have expertise. And then it's no longer important, and we let that expertise go, we retrain people. We don't need anyone who knows any Pashto. What we need are people who speak Mandarin Chinese. Or maybe we need people who speak both, because actually, the first is not necessarily completely lost in value. I think this is the thing, it's actually investing in long-term expertise and valuing that expertise. I'm sorry, I know there's a whole bunch of people from the FCDO or FCO in the room. I'm not sure what is in effect the culture of the generalist has often really suited as well. Interesting.
Now, in your books, you are interestingly optimistic about the long-term future of Russia. I think you say at one stage that democracy will return to Russia. Why? Why are you so optimistic?
I see Putin as a transitional figure. I see him very much as the last of the true Homo Sovieticus figures. And remember that, when Putin came to power, he was not the Putin that we now know. He actually, ironically, there are a lot of the sort of liberal St. Petersburg set who were delighted that Putin had been chosen to be the next president by Yeltsin, because they felt that this was a man who was not quite one of them, but was someone who could actually sort of bridge the gap between the liberals and the nationalists and actually sort of find some sort of common ground. Of course, that's not what happened. Putin, if he has, one of his skills that he does have is being all things to all people. He is this kind of grey Rorschach ink blot of a figure that different people can overlay their own personal sense of who Putin is. So Trump will have a very different Putin from you or I would have. But also he changed. But the thing is, if we now look at the next political generation, the 50-somethings and the 60-something-year-olds, many of whom are actually getting rather impatient as Putin's regime becomes a gerontocracy, where sort of almost all the key figures are, well, if you're lucky, they're 68. More often, they're sort of 70 years old onwards. These people are opportunist kleptocrats. And that's a good thing. I would say. I put my faith in corruption, in the sense that for the people around Putin, there is clearly a personal, emotional, ideological edge to what they're thinking. You know, when Putin talks about the West, and he so often goes back historically to talk about all the bad things that the West has done to Russia, there is clearly a very genuine personal animus there. He feels that Russia, and by extension him, have been done down. My experience, and however limited it is, and I'm not going to suggest that I kind of hobnob with oligarchs, but you know, I've encountered the odd minigarch and such like, is actually that the next political generation, they just really want to be able to steal in peace. They want to go back to the good old days of stealing at home, banking and spending abroad. Now, this does not make them good people. This does not make them in any way sort of people who necessarily would have a natural desire to bring democracy and so forth to Russia. But these are people who actually have a vested interest in the rule of law. When you've stolen everything, you want there to be law to protect and secure what you've stolen, and even more importantly, to allow you to pass that on to your successors, your children, or whatever. We've seen this process, whether we're talking about the robber barons in the United States or elsewhere. Now, in the 1990s, we saw what happens when you try to have democracy without rule of law. It doesn't work. Rule of law is the absolute prerequisite. And so I think the next political generation, they're not going to be Democrats, but they will have a reason to at least actually bring more rule of law to Russia. Which may mean, and I'd underline and boldface that may, it just means there is a possibility for the generation after that to be the actual Democrat generation. You know, I'm a historian by training and inclination. And I think in the longer term, there is this. Plus, final point I would make, Russians have actually got used to the idea that they have a say. Since February 2022, there has been a massive upsurge in the number of environmental protests in Russia. Now, that's not because suddenly the environment has got worse. It's because that is one of the few areas where it's still acceptable to protest. Because you pretend that it's about this rubbish dump that's leaking stuff into the water table, or you know, this road that's about to go through a habitat of some animal, rather than the government. No, it's not the government, it's this, even though you know that this is just simply a symptom of that. The point is, because that is one of the few areas where you can still express your desire to have some say, that is where people have gravitated to. And that tells me that even at the moment when this is a vicious, often spiteful police state, where if you go and protest against the war, it'll just be a question of how many seconds do you last before the police drag you off and give you a good beating before putting you up before a judge. So they don't do that. They find other ways of basically saying, we still matter. So, I mean, I should say that one of my future book projects is called Russia in Hell, which, despite the title, is an attempt to be optimistic, to try and think about the possible ways. And it's not that I guarantee you that Russia will become these things, but that I think it's very dangerous for us to rule Russia out. If we treat Russia as somewhere that is just eternally doomed to be a semi-fascistic, brutal, imperialist state, then we more or less are dooming it to be that, because we will treat it in such ways that it will actually respond in kind.
Now, one of the other themes in your book is that a Russia with such a long and ill-defined geographic, at least, boundary sees its security through expansion. That must give rise to the question, from a Russian perspective, of how much is enough. I mean, is it the Carpathians to the Black Sea? Is it?
I suppose that, yes, it's absolutely true. Catherine the Great famously said once, I have no way to defend my borders but to expand them. But we also have to realize that there is a point when reality sometimes comes to bite you. In theory, yes, when you listen to the more fringe Russian nationalists, they will precisely paint a picture of the fact that Russia needs a huge security barrier and such like. First of all, though, clearly, security now is not quite so clearly defined by boundaries. But also, if there is a silver lining for Russia from this ghastly war in Ukraine, is that it may be the Suez Crisis moment or the Algerian War moment, wherein a country that was an empire and hasn't yet psychologically come to terms with its new straitened circumstances, is forced to begin to confront reality and only begin. It's a slow process. I mean, we, of course, have totally outgrown our imperial past, but the French, I'm not sure. But, one way or the other, it takes time. And I think, therefore, yes, give Putin a magic ring with how many wishes, and who knows where Russia's borders would be. But at the same time, Russia has to think that actually how far is its security genuinely going to be guaranteed by actually having positive relations with the outside world. It has tried the imperial route, and quite frankly, it has failed. Sure, it's going to, it can still salvage something from its imperial adventure in Ukraine, but it has ultimately failed. And I think the process of learning that will help Russians define that actually maybe they're going to be damn lucky to hold on to what they've got. Mm-hmm.
Now, one final question from me. I have to ask you about the Russia-China relationship, because there's been a lot of speculation and comment about the balance of that relationship, where the balance of advantage lies, where the balance of power lies, what the Ukraine war has done to that. From everything that you've seen and talking to Russians, what's your perspective on that?
I mean, it is clear that Russia has become more and more dependent on China. And yes, that's visible in terms of sort of balance of trade and so forth. But it's also visible in, actually the majority of new cars being bought in Russia these days are Chinese. Dramatic change from where it was in 2021. But the interesting thing is that this is actually one of those topics where, again, we actually see a generational divide. For Putin, his war in Ukraine, which is, again, as I said, his war with the West, is the defining conflict. This is what is going to determine not just his historical legacy, but possibly his political survival and maybe even his actual survival. And therefore, whatever needs to be done to that end. And we've seen this, for example, ceding the South Caucasus more or less into Turkey's sphere of influence. Before 2022, that would never have happened, but he's accepted that. Well, likewise, he's willing to make whatever deal he needs to with the Chinese. And the Chinese know that. And they are driving very hard deals. If one looks at the energy situation, for example, the degree to which the Chinese know they have Putin over a barrel is very clear. But that's because this is going to be bad for Russia 10 years, 20 years down the line, but he's not able or willing to think of that. The next political generation down, though, are actually increasingly alarmed by this, and at times are even trying to signal to Putin that maybe that's the case. There's a fascinating little micro-scale example of this. 2022, 2023, there were several cases of Russian scientists and technicians who were spying for the Chinese, or at least were accused of, it is possible sometimes that people accused by the Russian state of spying are not actual spies. But anyway, there were these several cases, and it was technical spying. It was the Chinese who were looking for whatever leading-edge Russian technologies they had, particularly in terms of sort of submarine technology and the like. Now, in the past, of course, this always happened, but it would happen very quietly. There'd just be a little chat that maybe the second cultural attaché from the embassy in Moscow ought to be heading back to Beijing, and it would be done quietly. It was publicly stated. They actually said that it was the Chinese who were behind it. There were court cases and the like. And I was really quite perplexed by this until I spoke to someone who's a journalist who has very close, good connections into the security world, who's saying, well, actually, this was an attempt to try and signal to Putin, look, don't trust the Chinese. They have their own interests. They're actually stepping up their technical espionage against us. You need to be aware of this. And it says something when even the Federal Security Service, which is part of, in many ways, the central element of Putin's support base, but when middle rankers within that actually have to go public, in effect, just to try and catch the boss's attention, shows something about the fact of A, that there is a sort of concern about China, and B, that Putin just doesn't want to listen at the moment. So I think as long as this war goes on, and as long as Russia really has no alternatives, it will continue to spiral into the orbit of the Chinese economy.
Well, let me unleash the audience on you. We'll start wait for the microphone.
Stephen Deere, lifelong Russia watcher. Mark, I'd be interested in your comment on something which I see as a real problem coming down the line for Russia. And that is that whenever the war ends, you're going to have hundreds of thousands of angry men going back who've been very well paid at the front line, who are going back to poorly paid jobs, probably carrying weapons. We've already seen many of them, of course, former criminals, thanks to Wagner. And we've already seen at least 500 murders committed by such people. What do you think this effect is going to have on Russian society?
Yeah, I mean, this is a tough issue. And in fact, I have a report I'm currently writing for the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime out later this year on this very topic, because it clearly is one. And again, I mean, actually, first of all, it goes back to this issue of generational thing. I mean, it's not something that Putin seems to think is a problem. He says the right things about, oh, you know, these are all our heroes and our glorious people, and we need to make sure that they're looked after. But there is clearly no political thrust from the Kremlin to actually make good on those promises. Instead, what you have is the Ministry of Health doing some things, the Ministry of Internal Affairs doing other things, but having to squeeze them into whatever increasingly diminished and pressurized budgets they have, rather than anything else. And so there is a pretty widespread assumption that actually what we saw with the Afghan veterans, and remember, over 10 years, there were about 1 million Afghans, so about 100,000 a year sort of went through Afghanistan. We've already got over 1 million who have gone through Ukraine in 3 years. So, you know, now, okay, the Afghans came back to a country that was in collapse. You know, they came back in sort of the dying Soviet Union, where resources were even tighter and where there was a sort of a massive sense of kind of moral loss that no one really knew what to believe in. So it's not going to be quite the same in that respect, but the sheer critical mass of these soldiers. To that end, there's actually already some talk that they might have to, as and when there's a peace, stage demobilization. Now, on one level, that makes sense. So rather than trying to do, particularly the sort of medical and psychosocial services, you know, instead of just suddenly dumping 1 million well, on average, about 35% will probably have PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. You know, 350,000 people suddenly needing to be assessed and treated. You put it in stages, but just imagine that you're in one of the units that says, oh, I'm sorry, you're not in the first wave, and you're not in the second wave, but maybe in the third wave. So actually, you might end up, there's the danger also, they're worrying about possible, you know, not just desertions, but actually armed revolt, shall we say. But again, this is the interesting thing. There is this debate, but it's all happening at the sort of, again, the technocratic, the ministerial, the expert level. And the thing that they keep coming up against is there is no central policy, and there is no central commitment by resources in order to deal with it. So it's probably going to be, as ever with Russia, they know there's a sort of a tidal wave coming. It's just only as they start to get wet, they suddenly think, we need to do something about this.
Very question, just, yeah.
John Wilson, a member of GSF, several other think tanks. Several years ago, I was at a meeting in Whitehall at which the then Chief of the Defence Staff assured us that NATO was overwhelmingly more powerful than Russia. So why is it that we're losing the war in Ukraine? Did he mislead us, or are we to blame the politicians for the present predicament?
I mean, the answer is simple. NATO is not fighting in Ukraine. You know, if this were a, God forbid, Russia versus NATO fight, if we actually had sort of, you know, NATO forces rolling across the, you know, the East Ukrainian plains, then that might well be a different matter. But we're not. I mean, we are. Again, I get very infuriated by the degree to which we, and it's not just our politicians, but we have hidden behind mantras about, you know, as long as it takes, whatever it needs, etc. We are willing to provide the Ukrainians with a certain amount of aid. We're not willing to provide the Ukrainians with the one thing that they really need, which is manpower. Now, incidentally, I would add, I think that's the right decision. I would not want to see NATO soldiers fighting on the front lines in Ukraine. But I think that's the real issue, that there is a limit to how far we're willing to go for Ukraine, however much we're not willing to talk about that publicly.
Good. This question General, just here.
Thank you. David Abraham, former VP RUSI. I'd like to ask you whether in future, do you see Russia acting as a lone wolf, or do you see it forming alliances with other countries? And if so, where do you see Turkey's role? Because they're sitting very quietly on the sidelines.
Yeah, I think we have to realize that Putin's Russia doesn't really do alliances. It does transactional relationships. And even though it's signed sort of quite high-flown treaties with both Iran and indeed North Korea, which, like the North Korean one, technically speaking, obliges Russia to come to North Korea's assistance if it gets attacked. In practice, these are often frenemies more than anything else. You know, Iran is perfectly happy to sell the Russians drones, but that's the point. They're selling them. They're not giving them. This is not like the aid that Ukraine is getting from the West. And at the same time, Iran and Russia have different, sometimes complementary, but sometimes actually quite contradictory interests in the Middle East. So, I mean, I think we have to realize that we have a tendency to, again, with all these nice terms, axis of resistance and this, that, and the other, to, I think, make these countries look closer than they are. The fact of the matter is, these are a bunch of countries which have interests which are often at odds with ours in the West. They may well actually have their problems with the idea of sort of the current liberal world order. I mean, unfortunately, they now have an ally in Washington. But they're not real allies. Turkey is particularly a fascinating case in point. Erdogan has very, very effectively, essentially played every side off against the other. I mean, it helps also when you've got the largest land army in European NATO. But, you know, he is happy to deal with the Russians when it's convenient, and also happy to challenge the Russians when it's convenient. I mean, I remember back in 15, when a Russian bomber that was sort of operating in northern Syria just sort of was just nipping into Turkish airspace, and essentially it was ambushed and shot down. I mean, the Turks had three F-16s ready and waiting to take it down. Putin was clearly visibly furious, called this a betrayal, imposed sanctions. Again, I happened to be living in Moscow at the time, and overnight, all the Turkish produce disappeared from the supermarket shelves. Didn't matter. A couple of days later, it was replaced with Iranian. But Erdogan didn't back down. In many ways, Erdogan out-Putined Putin. And eventually, it was Putin who was forced to kind of accept a non-apology of the "I'm sorry I had to shoot down your plane" variety, and kind of said, well, you know, let bygones be bygones. So I think Erdogan has demonstrated that it is very possible for countries which are not the sort of what we would think of as conventionally the great powers, but if they're in an appropriate position to actually leverage that to their own effectiveness. It's a little bit like on a totally different sort of scene, the way that Hungary under Viktor Orban operates. But when it comes down to it, Erdogan is interested in Erdogan. And therefore, the Russians will get whatever advantage it is to Erdogan's, you know, sort of benefit to gain. And for example, he's very much pushing himself as a potential broker for future negotiations with Ukraine. I mean, he would love to have that not in Riyadh, but in Ankara or Istanbul. But if Putin became a problem, he would rediscover his transatlantic, NATO, Europe-looking roots. Again, it helps when you are on the borders of Europe and Asia.
So Malcolm.
Thank you very much, Malcolm Rifkind. Mark, when an attempt is being made to end a war by negotiations, it's normally only possible that it will succeed if both sides are prepared to make genuine compromises, not just rhetorical statements, but actual compromises. Now, we all have a pretty good idea of the compromises that Zelensky is already, in reality, prepared to make. Ukraine will not be part of NATO, that Ukraine will accept, at least for the foreseeable future, the Crimea, the Donbass will remain under the control of Russia. Not legitimately, but that will be the reality. Do you believe that Putin is capable of offering, at the end of the negotiation, not at the beginning, any genuine compromises in respect of territory? Is there a square inch of the territory he currently occupies that he'd be prepared to withdraw to the boundaries of 3 years ago? And indeed, would Kursk, for example, be a genuine negotiating point? We'll give you back Kursk if you give us back some of the territory you occupy. What's your best guess on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think leaving Kursk in the hands of the Ukrainians is not possible for Putin. And clearly he would twist and turn and bluster and bully to try and avoid having to give any kind of territorial concession back. But I think that if need be, he would. I mean, the point is, the front line, after all, is not a logical front line. It's just the byproduct of where they managed to make a breakthrough here and were able to push down a road there. So one could certainly find territory that probably Putin would be willing to give up. The interesting thing is actually that we're already getting a situation, and again, it comes back to this issue of almost like you have a government which is patriotic, but not necessarily Putinist at all times. There are clearly ideas which are floating around within the Russian expert community, overlapping Foreign Ministry, Security Council, Secretariat, and the sort of the think tank world, about other ways in which Russia could provide concessions. For example, about that 300 billion sitting in the Western banking system, that they could, for example, not openly say, you can have that for reparations, but just simply say, well, look, if you did take it, we would put up a little bit of a fuss, but basically we'd accept it. So, it will be a face-saving way of, in effect, providing reparations without Putin having to turn up in Kiev with a great big check for Zelensky. I think that when it comes down to it, it's very hard to know precisely where Putin would land in the end. But certainly amongst the people who advise him and who nudge him, who doesn't mean necessarily they get to shape his decisions, but they are clearly precisely looking at this issue of, when it comes down to it, what concessions can we provide? But of course, from Putin's point of view, he thinks he's winning, and therefore the big concession is, I will not push any further. That may not be something that we think of as a real concession.
Hi, I'm John Everard. I'm a former ambassador to North Korea. You've said you said a little bit already about Putin's relationship with North Korea, a frenemy, I think you said. On the North Korean side, they're desperate for this relationship. I mean, Kim Jong-un's economy is in tatters. He suffers constantly ebbing loyalty. His society is in turmoil. If Russia walks away, he's in deep trouble. What's your take on what happens when this war ends and Russia no longer needs this constant flow of hapless North Korean soldiers and North Korean munitions? Does Putin at that point then end the relationship, go back to the rather cool relationship that they had before, or would he want to keep it going for wider strategic reasons?
I mean, it's hard to think of what real wider strategic reasons there are, other than precisely that, occasional infusion of 500,000 not very good artillery rounds and, however many soldiers have been dispatched. Again, I mean, in some ways this goes back to the earlier thing about potential kind of sidewise concessions. Just as I think that the Russians might actually float the idea that they would scale down their operations in Africa as part of as a concession to reach a deal. It may well be that they will say, oh, and by the way, we'll essentially cut off North Korea. Because, there's no real sense that, in fact, this is in any other than military terms, this is not a useful relationship for Russia. There's nothing the North Koreans can offer, not even the new opportunities for tourism. and such like, which have been opened up. So that, I mean, the interesting thing for me would actually be where Beijing falls on this. Because obviously Beijing doesn't want North Korea to fall apart, because suddenly then it's got 10 million refugees on its border. So it may well be that Beijing will actually say, look, we'd like you to at least continue, providing some food and basic assistance just to keep this on life support so that we don't have to. But this is it. I mean, but in that case, it won't actually be because of North Korea. It'll just be a way of paying back Beijing. But no, I mean, the interesting thing is actually that there is no real enthusiasm for North Korea that I can find within the sort of Russian officialdom, even frankly the military or whatever. You're not getting articles in the press bigging up how great North Korea really is or anything like that. In some ways, I think they're keeping them as a disposable ally.
Good. Thank you. My name is John Dobson. I write for the Indian Sunday Guardian. Watching the behavior of Trump and Putin over the last month or so, the word leverage comes to mind. And with the word leverage comes compromat. When I worked in our embassy in Russia in 91, 94, I was very much aware of compromat. I don't know whether they tried it on you when you go there, but they certainly tried it on me. And I go back to 2013, Miss World contest, and of course the report that my former colleague Chris Steele wrote about the compromat that Putin has over Trump. Do you believe he has?
I'll be honest, I don't. I can't help feeling that if you're going to try and find someone to blackmail, someone like Donald Trump is actually your last choice, not your first. No, I mean, look, was he quite possibly involved in all kinds of gross and debauched conduct in Russia? Quite possibly, and particularly in the 1990s. There were a lot of wealthy or even just relatively wealthy Westerners who precisely treated Russia as a place to do that kind of stuff. Was he monitored? Quite possibly. Again, because no one at that point was thinking of him as a sort of future president, but nonetheless, he was a rich, prominent Westerner. You never know who might be useful. But I still come back to the fact that when it comes down to it, if intelligence agencies had leverage on Trump, I think they would have played him very, very differently. And I can't help but wonder if Trump actually would be able to keep quiet about anything. I'm amazed that he hasn't already been out on Truth Social saying that he's the bestest agent that Russia has ever had. I know this sounds all silly and trivial, but when it comes down to it, I have seen nothing to suggest that this is more than just simply a vain, narcissistic man who's out for himself, his own interests and his own ego, whom the Russians actually often are quite good at knowing how to play, but on the other hand, often they don't get to play. I do also know, final point I'll make here, is that there were certain people within Putin's circle who were actually quite nervous about a Putin-Trump phone conversation, because they weren't sure whether or not Putin would actually be able to play him properly. As it was, they need have had no worries. But again, the very fact that there are people who have these kind of concerns, to me, does not imply that they're all sitting there thinking, well, it doesn't matter, we have them in our pocket.
And we've got time for one quick final question. Sorry.
Thank you very much. Roger Munnings, I ran KPMG in Russia CIS for 12 years, and then transferred to the boards of Lukoil, Norilsk-Nickel and Sistema, and also chaired the Russo-British Chamber of Commerce, which sadly is, understandably, is dormant at the moment. Mark, thank you very much indeed. I find myself agreeing mostly with the pictures you paint based on very fluid circumstances. I've got one comment and a couple of questions. The comment very quickly is on environment. I think you're wrong. Russia's doing a huge amount on environment, and it was all triggered when Norilsk-Nickel dumped 20,000 tons of diesel oil into the tributary running into the Arctic Ocean back in, I think, 2015-16. We were fined $2 billion for that, but it woke up the country to environmental issues. And I think it's a great shame that we're not collaborating on those issues at the moment, because Russian science is pretty advanced on it. My two questions. There seem to me to be three important factors apart from the horrific human consequences of the conflict. The first is who pays for reparations, and you touched on that. The second would be what happens to Putin in due course. And third is what happens in the Donbass and the occupied territories. I wonder if Trump's a bit cleverer than we are thinking in terms of throwing the balls up in the air to enable a referendum in the Donbass in due course by calling Zelensky a dictator. We've already seen minerals and hydrocarbons discussions, and I wonder if he's going to engage Russia in that as a way to bring reparations. The thing I have no idea about is what happens with Putin. He would seem to be completely...
Forgive me, we've got to finish this.
I'm sorry. Let me finish. What do you think will happen with Putin? When will there be a change in leadership?
1 minute.
I would dearly love to have another answer. The answer, I think, is when he dies or is so incapacitated that he cannot rule. He may, before February 2022, have cultivated the potential for stepping down. But in this system, if you step down, you become entirely dependent on your successor. I don't think Putin, as a man who doesn't trust easily, would now feel he could trust his successor to keep him away from The Hague. So we just wait on Putin to go.
Well, Mark, fascinating. Your answers earlier made me reflect on two things from our own history. The first is that the Danes were perfectly happy to pillage, burn and plunder all of the east coast of England until they actually settled down there and owned the stuff themselves, and then they just wanted security and stability. And the other is that we pride ourselves on Magna Carta, which was, of course, rule of law, not democracy. That came well before democracy. So a couple of interesting lessons from our own history. You have entertained and informed us in equal measure, and you've also given us a lot to ponder on. We're enormously grateful to you. Thank you very much indeed for coming along today. And with that, I draw the session to a close.